You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
On a cold fall morning in 1999, 51-year-old Martin Henry walked across the linoleum flooring at the Glister Mary Lee popcorn plant in Jasper, Missouri. The fluorescent lights overhead glinted on all the stainless steel machinery that covered the manufacturing floor. Workers bustled around their stations, already hard at work despite the early hour. A young man followed behind Martin as he walked the plant floor. He was a new hire, and he was taking notes as Martin pointed at different machines and explained how they worked. He gestured at the dozens of employees working all around the room and jokingly told the new guy that he should try to meet everybody. The new guy just started laughing. That's because the new guy knew everybody here already. Jasper was a town of just 1,000 people, and the popcorn factory employed about 15% of them. Martin had instantly recognized the new guy from around town the moment he had showed up that day. Martin led the new hire over to the workstation that he knew best, the mixer room where he had worked for most of the past 2 years. Martin manned the machine that coated each popcorn kernel with buttery flavoring. He liked to think of himself as the guy who made the popcorn taste just like it did at the movies. Martin took a keyring out of his pocket and turned on the mixing machines. A moment later, a puff of yellow mist leaked out of the top of the largest mixer, and right away this wonderful buttery scent filled the air. Martin peeled off his rubber gloves and grabbed a new pair. Then he showed the new guy how to work all the different buttons and toggles in the mixing room and what the different level readings meant. Then he pressed a few buttons, and the machine hummed into action. Martin stepped aside and told his new trainee to give the mixers a try. So the young man turned on the spigot on one of the two smaller mixing tanks, letting butter flavoring pour out into a plastic 5-gallon bucket. As Martin stood there with his hands on his hips, he felt proud of his work. But he also felt distracted because his arms felt so dry and itchy. They had been that way all week, something he blamed on the changing weather. He was glad that his thick rubber gloves and long-sleeved white coat prevented him from scratching. Otherwise, he feared he might scratch himself bloody. But after only a few minutes of standing there, Martin just couldn't stand the itching any longer. So he excused himself from the new hire and then hustled over to the locker room where he could scratch himself to his heart's content and douse himself in more lotion. A few months later, Martin's wife, Linda Henry, rolled out of bed and began walking over to the bathroom she shared with her husband. As she did, she heard her husband moving, and she turned and saw him roll over in bed and reach for the phone on the nightstand. To protect his skin, Martin's hands were actually wrapped in plastic bags, which crinkled as he punched in the phone number he was trying to press. He was calling into work, letting them know he needed a sick day to deal with his ongoing skin problem. She heard him say that the pain was unbearable, which to her seemed like an understatement. Linda walked into the bathroom and opened up the medicine cabinet and grabbed a half-empty jar of Vaseline. For the past few weeks, her husband's hands had been so chapped and flaky that Linda had been coating them in Vaseline and then wrapping them in those plastic bags while he slept, both to prevent scratching and to keep his skin from falling off onto their sheets. For the past couple of weeks, the skin on Martin's hands and legs had gotten so papery and ashen that it had started falling off in 2 to 3 inch chunks. Now, historically, Martin did typically get dry hands in the winter, but it had never gotten this bad before. Linda couldn't imagine what might be causing this severe skin condition, but she was very worried about her husband. He seemed to always be in pain. At first, she blamed his job at the factory. Constant hand washing and changing rubber gloves and cleaning the machines with harsh chemicals couldn't be doing him any favors. But Martin assured her that none of his symptoms got worse while he was at work, and they didn't improve while he was home. Besides, none of the other employees had developed skin conditions. Now, Martin's reasoning made enough sense, but now, as Linda helped Martin remove the bags from his Vaseline-covered hands, it was clear, at least to her, that something was terribly wrong here, and almost certainly it had to do with his job. I mean, what else could it be? And so after saying as much to her husband, Martin finally relented and said that he would file for workers' compensation insurance, claiming he had developed the skin disease from work. 2 months later, Linda was just about to start making dinner when she heard the mail fall through the slot in their front door. Her eyes widened when she saw it was an envelope from the factory's insurance company. She hoped it was good news about her husband's workers' compensation. She carried the envelope into the living room where Martin was sitting back in his easy chair. His hands were covered in bloody red patches where his skin had fallen off. But now, Martin had more to worry about than just a skin disease. Over the past few weeks, Martin had also developed severe difficulty breathing, which really frightened Linda. He'd gone to the doctor, but the doctor said very likely his shortness of breath was unconnected to whatever was going on with his dry skin. The doctor said his breathing issue seemed like a standard case of bronchitis, or maybe he'd developed asthma. But none of the medicines the doctor prescribed for these conditions had helped Martin's breathing. And so Martin spent most days coughing and wheezing and sometimes even gasping for air. He could barely get up the stairs to their bedroom at night. The recliner was the only place he felt somewhat comfortable. When Linda entered the room, she could see her husband was asleep in the chair. She could hear his soft wheezing. But she felt like this envelope was worth waking him up for. They really needed some good news, and this could be it. So she walked over and tapped gently on her husband's shoulder, and he opened his eyes and immediately just began hacking and coughing, as always. Linda handed him the letter, and when he saw what it was, his eyes went wide. He was eager to see what it would say. By this point, because of Martin's medical issues, he basically didn't leave the house anymore. And he hadn't gone back to work ever since that day he called in sick 2 months earlier. And he and his wife were just at a loss. They couldn't understand how Martin, a seemingly healthy 51-year-old man, could become this sick so quickly. And out of the two of them, Linda was also very convinced that whatever was going on with him really did have to do with his job. It had to be the cause. Also, by now, rumors were starting to spread that other workers at the factory had also become ill. Although they didn't seem as bad off as Martin, their symptoms were similar: wheezing cough, trouble breathing, and this horrible skin rash. And so as Linda watched her now very frail husband open up this envelope, causing bits of his skin to flake off and fall to the carpet, she hoped the other men from the factory would also apply for workers' compensation too, because clearly something was terribly wrong at that factory. Linda watched Martin take the sheet of paper out of the envelope and read it over. Then Martin cursed and told her bitterly that his workers' compensation claim had been denied. The company's doctor had evaluated Martin before his breathing problems started, and so the only thing he had been evaluated for was his skin condition. And there wasn't enough evidence to prove his dry, flaking skin was caused by conditions at the factory. And so if Martin and Linda were going to get some financial help, it would have to come from somewhere else. A few weeks later, in April of 2000, Dr. Thomas Carter reviewed some paperwork at his desk in Kansas City, Missouri. Dr. Carter was an occupational health physician, and he'd been alerted to the strange medical cases coming out of the popcorn plant in Joplin. Over the past few weeks, Dr. Carter had interviewed Martin, along with 7 other popcorn factory workers, all of them struggling to breathe and suffering rashes all over their bodies. He now had medical records for all 8 workers, and the details had shocked him. All 8 had been given different diagnoses, like asthma, bronchitis, and emphysema, but their symptoms were almost identical. All 8 men were struggling to get air into their lungs, and medication had been ineffective in treating their symptoms. One of the workers was 44 years old, but his lung capacity had been reduced to that of a small child. Given all the evidence, Dr. Carter had drawn a chilling conclusion. In his opinion, Martin and the 7 other workers had a rare but often fatal lung disease called bronchiolitis obliterans, which literally meant the obliteration of the lungs' airways. Most people with this condition die within 5 years as their airways become increasingly inflamed and then scarred, making breathing extremely difficult. It can also cause the painful skin condition Martin was experiencing, although many doctors don't make the connection. And so while Martin and his co-workers were grateful to now have this information about what was happening to their bodies, at the same time, they were devastated. This condition they had was irreversible, and unless they got a lung transplant, they would die. In all of Dr. Carter's 25-year career, he'd only ever seen this disease 3 times. And now, there were 8 cases in a single town of only 1,000 people, and all 8 of those people worked at the same factory. Those were epidemic-level numbers. and so Dr. Carter picked up the phone and called the Missouri Department of Health and Human Services. 6 months later, in November of 2000, Dr. Rebecca Roberts stood on the factory floor at the popcorn plant, watching several factory workers breathe into small plastic devices called spirometers. Dr. Roberts had flown into Jasper the night before from Washington, D.C. She worked at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and this popcorn facility had been on her radar for a while now. Over the summer, Dr. Roberts and her team had learned about the 8 factory workers who had developed the terrible respiratory disease called bronchiolitis obliterans. She also knew that investigators from another agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, had inspected the popcorn facility. But the OSHA investigators didn't find any health or safety violations. But despite their findings, Dr. Roberts just couldn't get around the idea that there had to be some connection to this factory. I mean, the idea that 8 workers all at the same plant all developed the same rare lung disease, it couldn't be coincidence. So that August and September, she had personally conducted 2 walkthrough investigations of the popcorn plant. Now, during those visits, Dr. Roberts had not spotted any obvious red flags. But she still was not convinced that this factory was safe. So she had decided to return to the factory one more time, and this time she brought a medical team to do a more detailed survey. Today, her team was interviewing workers at the factory and using these spirometers to measure their breathing. While Dr. Roberts' team talked to workers on the main factory floor, she turned her attention to the mixing room, where Martin once worked. There was only one man in the mixing room, moving buckets of butter flavoring from one vat to another. When Dr. Roberts introduced herself, he shook her hand and said that his name was Simon. Then he began to cough into the crook of his elbow, and as he did, he kind of shook his head, cursing under his breath. Dr. Roberts asked him if he was coming down with something. Simon told her he'd had a cough for a while now. He laughed and said it actually helped him fit in, because pretty much everybody who worked in the mixing and packaging rooms had asthma or bronchitis or something like that, and so everybody was coughing all the time. After this short conversation, Dr. Roberts climbed up a nearby metal staircase to the mezzanine, which looked out over the mixing room. There were a few men working there, and she quickly waved them over. A tall guy with a hairnet came over first, and Dr. Roberts asked him if he had breathing problems too. The man nodded and said the doctors diagnosed him with asthma. He said he developed it over the past year, but for whatever reason, asthma medications did not seem to help at all. By the time Dr. Roberts left the factory an hour later, she had no doubt that there had to be a serious health problem at the Glister Mary Lee popcorn plant, and that it very likely started in the mixing room. But she still could not pinpoint exactly what the problem was. So she decided that investigators would need to visit the factory one more time. And this time, they'd take samples of everything. The popcorn, the flavoring mixtures, the cleaning products, and any hint of dust or mold. Whatever was in there making these workers sick, she was determined to find it. A few weeks later, inside of a lab, Dr. Roberts, along with 2 lab researchers, stared into a big plastic rodent cage full of rats that they were using in an experiment. Dr. Roberts and her team had tested all the samples they had collected from the popcorn plant. They'd identified 100 different potentially toxic compounds in those samples, but none of them seemed to be what was making people sick. Dr. Roberts had been very frustrated, but she did have one more idea. There was one more chemical that she wanted to test on the rats. This chemical was normally considered to be safe to eat, but there had been very little research done on what would happen if someone inhaled it. And sure enough, after the rats breathed in a large amount of the chemical, their breathing became shallow and labored. Later, when examined under a microscope, their lungs were revealed to be inflamed and scarred, just like human victims of bronchiolitis obliterans. Dr. Roberts finally had her answer. This seemingly innocent chemical was causing the disease plaguing Martin and the other workers. The tests that Dr. Roberts and her team did proved that it was the delicious-smelling butter-flavoring mixture that was making the workers sick. Specifically, a chemical in the mixture called diacetyl. Diacetyl is a naturally occurring substance found in things like beer, butter, cheese, and coffee, and it can be used as artificial flavoring. No one suspected diacetyl because the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, had already determined it was safe to eat. But Dr. Roberts realized the FDA never tested whether diacetyl was safe to breathe, and it definitely was not. And the factory where Martin worked was using 3 times the diacetyl found in most butter flavorings at other factories. The deadly fumes wreaked havoc on employees' skin and lungs, creating irreversible damage. But Martin and his coworkers were not the only popcorn factory workers in danger. In October of 2001, there were 140 popcorn plants in the United States, and they were all using this butter mixture with dangerous levels of diacetyl. Even worse, there were thousands of other businesses that either made or used butter flavoring with diacetyl. That meant thousands of workers nationwide were at risk of developing what came to be called popcorn lung disease. In December of 2003, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health issued warnings to more than 4,000 businesses that either made or used this butter flavoring. In response, 80% of American popcorn makers stopped using diacetyl in their butter flavoring and switched to something else. Now, this made current and future workers much safer, but this did nothing to curb the damage that had already been done by the diacetyl poisoning. One of the workers at Martin's factory was awarded $20 million for the damage to his health, and part of that settlement was intended to go to the factory's other victims, including Martin Henry. However, the comfort from that settlement would be short-lived, because Martin would die on May 22, 2010. He was only 62 years old.